Inspiration for Teachers podcast, bringing you dynamic and inspirational educator interviews. Our fascinating guests share their professional challenges and creative resolutions for success. Discover their workable strategies, ideas, and resources to reach your educational goals. And now your host, Kelly Long.
Welcome to another episode of Inspiration for Teachers. I've been so excited to share this episode with you for three main reasons. We have an excellent guest coming up on the show who is Lindsey Adams. She's going to be discussing with us the challenges faced by teachers that want to emigrate and teach abroad, how to research that job, how to prepare and interview well, and what is super crucial, how to survive that first 6 months, because I'm sure you will feel like an NQT all over again. She's also got some sizzling ideas for lesson plans and resources, so stay tuned. Secondly, a huge booyah to all of our subscribers, Facebook group members, Twitter followers, Pinterest and YouTube engagers. Oh my goodness, your subscription to our podcast has boosted us to the iTunes new and noteworthy educational section, which has given us huge ability to connect with other educators. So thank you. It is your passion for knowledge and desire to inspire others that has catapulted us into that awesome position. And then another thanks of gratitude to all of our guests that come on our show. It is their generosity of time and their knowledge and their commitment that is helping us to create and inspire educators everywhere on a weekly basis. So from me to you, a huge personal thanks, because you are helping me in my own teaching. I've always got your ideas, your recommendations and your voices, which probably I shouldn't admit, going on in my head whenever I'm in my classroom and I'm teaching my pupils. So huge thanks to you. Please continue to inspire us. And now moving on to today's guest, I'd like to welcome Lindsey Adams. Hello Lindsey, and welcome to the show.
Hello Kelly, thank you very much for having me. I'm ready to get started.
Lindsey has been a teacher of business studies and a head of department both here in the UK and in New Zealand for 10 years. She specialises in teaching sixth form students in AS and A2 business studies. She has been a mentor of new teachers into the profession and has worked closely with schools and colleges to deliver workshops to enhance pupils' understanding of enterprise and work-related learning. She has been a project manager for a number of initiatives aimed at NEET, teenagers and adults. Lindsey has also been a lead project manager for the National Citizen Service, which is a government initiative aimed at giving all 16-year-olds a social and economic awareness. And if that is not enough, Lindsey has also been a teaching and learning coach, holding regular professional and coaching sessions with her fellow teachers on developing teaching initiatives whilst encouraging teachers to challenge and stretch their students. At the start of every show, I like to break the ice and have a light-hearted bit of fun and play a game of random question generator. It always makes my guests super nervous because they have no prior knowledge of the questions. Lindsey, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Who was your favourite teacher at school and why?
That's a very good question. I would have to say that it was my English teacher when I was at school. But he was just really inspirational and really engaging when he was delivering. He knew his subject inside out, and as a result had a real passion for it, which kind of made us then have a passion for it as well.
And do you think you took anything away from that, and do you think you embed that into your own teaching practice?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's something that I always try and work on, and I think if you make it fun, if you make it interesting, then that's when they're going to learn.
Excellent. Thank you, Lindsey. Thanks for sharing that with us. So Lindsey, please take a moment and tell us what excites you right now about the teaching profession.
Well, there's a couple of things that excite me, specifically related to my subject. The first of all is that we're kind of living in a time where our economy is rapidly changing. I find that teaching within such changing and exciting economic times means there's much more examples you can use with your students. You can encourage them to kind of predict what's going to happen, and really kind of like just get them excited about what's going on in their own country and also what's kind of going on internationally. That's the first thing that excites me. And secondly, it's very much the kind of use of technology and social media and how we're going to have to embrace that within our teaching if we want to kind of bring our teaching into the 21st century. The place for business studies now is, if you're making marketing materials, if you're talking about marketing, you can't exclude the use of Facebook, the use of Twitter, of social media in general, because they're such key concepts that the students have to know about. They should be creating professional marketing materials, moving away from kind of pens and paper posters on the wall to using things like Photoshop and web design tools and kind of graphics packages. We're already seeing students that expect to be able to use their own tablets and devices and phones and things within our classroom. And sometimes I feel as teachers and as professionals as a whole, we're that one step behind them. So I think we really need to kind of work on making sure that we have the skills and the knowledge to be able to work alongside our students. And like I say, within business studies, I think that's really fundamental and something really exciting that we can kind of work on together.
I think sometimes, Lindsey, it's quite difficult when you're planning all the time and the curriculum is changing, that we just don't have the time to be up to scratch in our classroom in terms of having the knowledge to back up what we're trying to teach our pupils. And that's really difficult, don't you think?
I 100% agree. So it's an upskilling, really. And I think a lot of that is down to kind of the schools to make sure that their teachers are getting that professional development, to make sure they have those skills, because these are the skills that our students are coming to us with and what the workplace needs and demands, and we've got to make sure that we're providing that.
This next question is really gritty and can be a complete can of worms, but I think it's important to have an open discussion. So Lindsey, please tell us, what aspect of teaching or education, large or small, would you most like to change and why?
Well, personally, I would like to see the shift going back to the focus being on teaching and learning and what's happening in the classroom, rather than the constant need for assessment, the constant need for reporting and feeding back to students. I think there's huge demands, particularly on secondary school teachers, in regards to marking books every 2 weeks, having to write SMART targets and so forth. And, it's been proven time and time again that most of the time they don't even read the comments that we are spending hours and hours writing for them. And actually using techniques such as peer marking and assessment for learning are far more effective than this constant need to report and set targets.
And now that we are talking about challenges, Lindsey, please can you tell us what your professional challenge was and how you addressed it?
Well, basically, I decided that I wanted a bit of a change and a new challenge. So I decided that I'd quite like to go and teach abroad. And that in itself opens a can of worms, because you need to kind of think about, well, where would I like to go? Obviously, there's the financial benefits of going to the Middle East. There's the proximity of going to schools in Europe, but that presents language issues. So I kind of decided that I would like to look at maybe Australia or New Zealand, because they were parts of the world I'd never been to, and it was quite culturally similar to ours. But I found that kind of the whole process from applying for the position, making sure I had all the visas and paperwork in place, through to then upskilling my knowledge so that I was able to teach AS and A2 business studies, which I hadn't done before, in a totally different environment with a different economy to ours, and with students that differed greatly from ours, far more than I anticipated actually. All of those things were quite challenging within themselves.
Why did the pupils differ to pupils in the UK?
Because initially when I first went to New Zealand, I was teaching in a private school, and so it struck me immediately how much they just had this amazing thirst for knowledge and wanting to learn. Practically every single student within my classroom wanted to be there, wanted to learn, wanted to get the best grades that they could, which sounds ideal, like a dream, but actually it puts quite a lot of pressure on you as a teacher to constantly keep challenging those students and making sure that you have the resources in place to be kind of able to stretch them and let them to achieve those higher level grades. And also it meant that myself having to being able to understand, how do I achieve an A grade or an A star grade in AS and A2 business studies? What are the essay techniques? What sort of questions are we likely to expect in the exam and so forth? And as I mentioned before, having never taught those before, it meant a huge learning curve for me, actually learning that information very rapidly whilst trying to adapt to new surroundings and develop a social life and find a place to live.
You must have felt like an NQT all over again.
Yep, definitely. And there were many, many nights of crying and convincing myself that I couldn't possibly do this. And yeah, it very much was like being an NQT in that I would be prepared maybe 2 days in advance. So I would teach my lessons, and then I would spend 3 or 4 hours that night planning my lessons for the next day, and not just planning my lessons, but actually reading the textbook, processing the knowledge that I needed to be able to then teach the students, as well as coming up with the resources to try and make it interesting and creative for them. And then the next day teaching the lessons, and again after school spending another 3 or 4 hours working on the knowledge and working on the resources, ready to start again.
So you didn't actually have a social life?
I managed to squeeze in a few kind of trips around the country, and that brings a very important thing actually, in that in New Zealand they don't have half terms. So basically you work 12 weeks and then you get 2 weeks off, 12 weeks, 2 weeks off, and so forth, and you get the 6 weeks off for the summer. And having come from a system where I was used to doing 6 or 7 weeks with a week off, doing 12 weeks straight was blooming hard work.
You must have been knackered.
To put it mildly, yeah.
So you had all those challenges to face, Lindsey. Can you tell us, what did you do? What did you put in place to overcome some of those challenges?
Well, first of all, in terms of obtaining the position, I did my research on how to kind of get teaching jobs abroad, and there are a number of different options open to you, from using agencies and so forth. But actually the best way is just to look in the international section of the TES, and that's where my job was advertised, and I was actually employed over the telephone. I had no face-to-face interview, and then 8 weeks later I touched down in New Zealand, having never been there or met anybody there. But one tip I would give, if you are, it sounds absolutely crazy, but if you are being interviewed over the phone, you still need to be prepared in exactly the same way as a face-to-face interview. So write out your notes, think about possible questions, and I even sat at midnight in my full-on suit on my on my couch in my living room, so I could get myself in the professional frame of mind for an interview. And so then after that I spent a lot of time rapidly looking into the visa process, the costs of things, because it is very tempting to go out on a tourist visa and then sort the paperwork out when I was there. But that's something I would kind of highly not recommend, because if you've ever watched Border Patrol, if you get caught going on a tourist visa when you're going to work, it can cause all sorts of problems for you.
Well, that's a good tip.
Yeah, so make sure you do your homework and you have your paperwork in place before you go. And I also, in terms of trying to find out about the economy, I did a lot of research looking at newspapers, and I also watched with my students every morning something called 90 Seconds at 9 o'clock, which gave an overview of what was going on in the New Zealand economy, so that they were up to date with it, but also so that I was up to date with what was going on as well. And I used a number of different kind of assessment for learning techniques within the class with the students, and really kind of empowered them so that they were teaching me. So whenever we kind of like did a topic such as privatisation versus nationalisation, I would make them take a business that had been recently privatised or one that was nationalised within their country, and they had to produce a kind of presentation which they delivered back to me and the rest of the class, where they kind of talked about that business and its turnover and what had happened to it in recent times and so forth. And that helped me to learn about the different businesses within New Zealand directly from them. And also I did a lot of brainstorming sessions with them, where they were telling me about the different businesses and the different changes, and we talked a lot about things like house prices and stuff. So I actually really used my students to teach me about what was going on, so that I could then use that information to apply it to the content they needed within their qualification.
And you can find Lindsey's podcast notes to this episode on our resources page at www.inspirationforteachers.com. Don't forget the number 4 in the URL. So now that we feel all warm and fuzzy, let's move on to our inspiration round. On the show, I like to share the successes of our guests and find out what lights them up in the classroom. So Lindsey, please share with us your proudest moment.
Well, I have 2 proudest moments. The first one is, as I mentioned, I taught the Cambridge International qualification when I first arrived in New Zealand, and basically the qualification is taught across a number of countries. I want to say 25, but I wouldn't absolutely swear by that, around the world, like in the kind of Middle East and in Asia and so forth. At the end of the year, it gets announced the top mark in the country and then also the top mark in the world. And I was very privileged to have one year a student of mine, a very lovely young lady, that achieved top in the world for A2 business studies, which means that she got the top mark across all of the students around the world that sat that qualification. And that in itself made me extremely proud, but it was also further enhanced by the fact that I had taught her for GCSE and for AS and then for A2. So I was really able to see her progress and grow as a student before she achieved that mark. And my other proudest moment is when I was teaching, again in New Zealand, in the state system. It was much more coursework focused, and one of their units they had to basically put on and run a business event. And I had about 50 or 60 students across 2 classes, and I decided that actually I really wanted to make a difference with this. So we decided that we were going to run a charity auction, and each within the class they got into teams, and each team was responsible for sourcing their own auction items. We then, from local businesses, things varying from, meat packages to beauty vouchers and so forth. And we then held an auction. We got a local TV personality to be our auctioneer and invited kind of members of the public and parents and so forth to come and to bid on the items. And we actually raised approximately $4,000 for local charities within Auckland. And the kids just did phenomenally well, far exceeded my expectations. The learning and that they got from that process, as well as completing their coursework, was phenomenal. Every single group at the beginning was very reluctant to try and talk to businesses and get prizes and stuff, but they all managed it, and by the end they were absolutely buzzing by the experience. So I would say that those 2 things are my proudest moments so far in teaching.
Sometimes it can feel like a really thankless job being a teacher, but it's wonderful when pupils exceed our expectations. So thank you for sharing that with us, Lindsey. So, Lindsey, please can you share with our listeners the best advice you've ever received?
Yeah, the best advice I ever received was probably in my 2nd or 3rd year of teaching. I used to go to bed many nights constantly worrying about what if my students failed, what if they didn't pass, what if they didn't obtain the grades they needed to go to college or to university. A fellow colleague actually said to me, you can only do your best and the rest is up to them. And we need to focus on our successes rather than our failures. And I think that's a really poignant thing, because we are, as teachers, and especially in the environment today and the way we're judged, we instantly, when we receive our results at the end of the year, the very first thing is we pick out that 1 or 2 students which did not perform as well as we hoped they would, and we get upset by it, and we think, well, what's happened there? Why has that happened? Is it my fault? Well, actually, there are a number of students that either meet or far exceed our expectations and do better than we ever hoped. And a lot of the time, I think we kind of lose sight of that by focusing so much on those students that don't achieve their full potential, because ultimately, as I've said, you can only do your very best and then the rest is up to them.
Very true. We often have to justify why those few children didn't hit the mark. There's never the question, which is, what did they do to actually attempt to do well in their exams?
Yeah, definitely. And, I had an example this year where I had a boy that didn't do as well as I thought. And then I was speaking to his friend and I said, what happened with so-and-so? I was really disappointed. And he turned around and said, well, actually, he went to a party the night before the exam and didn't really do any revision. And it kind of really hit home to me that actually, although I'd spent all that time and effort and worried on that student, the fact that he chose to do that the night before his exam was his choice, and therefore that's what would have had a direct impact on his result, not what I'd been teaching him in the classroom.
And now on to your sources of inspiration, Lindsey.
Well, for me, my biggest sources of inspiration have got to be my students. There's been a number of students over the years that have gone on to forge extremely successful careers for themselves, both in the UK and internationally. And some of those haven't always come from the best starts or haven't always taken the most traditional routes in education, and it hasn't always come easy to them. But they've embraced what they have, and they've worked really hard, and as a result they have progressed really far in life. It's not always just about how well they've done in their careers and academically, but also, personally and socially as well. And if you have a student that at the beginning of when you first teach them can hardly speak in front of a class and lacks extreme confidence, and then by the time they leave you, they're up giving presentations to 30 people, you've got to count that as a success in its own right, along with how well they perform academically.
That's a really powerful answer. Thank you for sharing that with us, Lindsey. Share with us a personal teaching or education habit that works for you time and again.
Well, this is something I discovered when I was a teaching and learning coach, and I read a really interesting article about the use of choice within teaching. And so I decided to do an experiment, And the results were quite outstanding, really. And I actually found that, say for example, in a coursework situation, although all students had to achieve the same criteria, if I gave them the choice of which business to study, then their motivation and their inspiration actually raised quite dramatically, because they were able to pick something that they were interested in, and as a result they were more enthusiastic about it. And so it's something that I've tried to build in a lot more into my teaching, is the use of choice, where the option is there to give students choice about which way round to do things, which businesses to study. Like if they're writing a business plan, who's in charge of what within their plan, and which aspects they do first, and so forth, then I find that motivation does increase dramatically.
So would you say you gave your students a completely free rein, or do you think you give them a scaffolded choice as to what businesses they can select?
I think it very much varies. In certain situations, if they have to find certain information and that information is quite difficult to find, then I will scaffold them more, and I will give them a number of different businesses which I know the information exists for to pick from, and then they can work from there. Whereas actually, as much as possible, I try to give them a free rein of what businesses they study, because again, the more choice that you give them, the more motivated they tend to be.
Lindsey, do you have a resource you can share with our listeners, internet or otherwise, that would add value to them in their daily practice?
One resource that I found that is very effective is something called the BP oil trading game. Now it's all online. If you put it into Google, you'll find it. And the aim of it is to kind of give students the chance to look at economic awareness and also a bit of accounting calculations and so forth in there. And what it involves is basically students, they work in teams, and they are given a certain number of barrels of oil. It takes place in trading rounds. You have about 10 different trading rounds, and an economic event will flash up on the screen via a PowerPoint, something like that there's a fire in the Middle East. And the students then have to predict how that will affect the supply and demand of oil. And they then have a certain amount of time where they decide how many barrels of oil they're either going to buy or they're going to sell. And then they give that in to the trader at the front, and then it flashes up the price of oil has either risen or fallen, and they then have to calculate how much their oil is worth. And then another economic event will flash up, and they have to again decide how many barrels of oil they are going to buy or sell. And it really introduces them to the world of trading. It works on numeracy and accounting, because they have to work out what their profit's going to be, and it introduces them to the whole concept of supply and demand, how economic events can change the supply and demand for certain commodities. Now there is a GCSE version, and there is also an A-level version as well, and so you can make it progressively harder if you want to. And I actually built this into one of my observation lessons. It was looked at really favourably, and the students just thoroughly enjoyed it, and I asked them for feedback at the end. And they all said things like, it was really good to be able to apply what we've been learning to a real life situation. They liked how fast paced it was. Definitely check it out. And like I say, it's all there for you. You just kind of download the trading sheets.
You can find all of these resources on our website at www.inspirationforteachers.com. And finally, Lindsey, before we say goodbye, if our listeners want to get in contact with you, where can they reach you?
Well, the best way to reach me would be via email. And my email address is lindsey_jada@hotmail.com. Drop me a line and I'll be happy to discuss anything that we've covered in the programme today.
And thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Lindsey. We've really appreciated your advice, your tips and your resources.
Not a problem. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today on Inspiration for Teachers. For more resources, tips and advice, visit our website, inspirationforteachers.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we would love to connect with you. Just click like on our Facebook page at facebook.com/inspirationforteachers.